Recording in progress.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today and welcome to our session, The Political Economy of State Building in Latin America. Without any further ado, please welcome our chair, Mr. Juan Fergusson, to open the session. Mr. Juan Fergusson, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. We're very pleased to be here with this very interesting session on the political economy of state building in Latin America. I have the pleasure of being the chair of this session that features three very renowned academics in Latin America working on political economy. The first speaker is going to be Leopoldo Fergusson from Universidad de Los Andes. Leopoldo is a full professor of economics at Universidad de Los Andes in Colombia. Then we're going to have the second speaker, Maria Micaela Sviatschi from Princeton University. And finally, we're going to have Luis Martinez from University of Chicago, the Harvard School of Public Policy. So we have a spectacular panel, and I hope you enjoy this session. Please type your questions in the chat, and we will allow between 5 and 10 minutes at the end for questions for the three papers. So I'm going to jump from one paper to the other right away, and then we're going to allow for enough time at the end for Q&A. So welcome everyone, and the first paper, as I said, is by Leopoldo Fergusson from Universidad de Los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia. Welcome, Leopoldo.
Thank you, Juan. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to begin my talk. So you should be seeing it now. So first of all, it's very nice to be in the part of this panel, sharing with Luis and Mika and Juan. Thank you for organizing it. Now I want to, let me just, I cannot do two things at the same time. Okay, let me switch to full screen. Good. So the paper that I'm going to share with you, its title has changed a bit. We're now emphasizing more the fact that we're looking at political incentives and corruption, and the evidence comes from ghosts in Colombia. You'll see in a second what I mean by that. This is joint work with Arturo Harker, a professor at Los Andes in the School of Government, Carlos Molina, who is currently at MIT, and Juan Camilo Yamin, shortly starting his PhD at Brown. So what this paper is about is essentially we're looking at a phenomenon that is very common in Colombia and in other countries, which is one form of diverting resources, which essentially is creating fake beneficiaries of public services so as to get money and then capture some of that money in the form of transfers from the central government or from other layers of government. And so I have several examples here from news stories, and you can see the translation in the right. So, you know, creating fake patients from hemophilia, creating fake patients from AIDS, and getting money from the public health care system, and then diverting that money. And the case that we're going to look at is the one that is in the bottom of the slide, which has to do with creating fake students. And in all of these cases,
Leopoldo,
what you have is a very similar scheme in which you...
Leopoldo, can you hear me? I think that we are seeing the intro slide. It's not seeing the next one.
Oh.
We can only
Thank
see
you for letting
the
me
title.
know, Mika. Okay, so I'm going to, you are seeing it now?
Now, yes. Now, yes.
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay, so I'm not going to do full screen mode because maybe that's what's going on. And sorry that the screen is not as big as it could be. but this way I make sure that you can see what I'm talking about. So we have these 3 news stories that I was talking about that you couldn't see. Now, luckily, now you can see them. Thank you, Mika. And now, in all of these, the scheme is creating a ghost, creating some fake beneficiary and increasing the transfers. And so what in this paper we try to do is we look at this form of corruption and we ask whether this is for public gain or for public benefit, in the sense that you could ask, why is it that we have more fake beneficiaries or ghosts? And the most prevalent idea is probably because you want to capture those resources, but you have to admit that it also could be because you want to increase service delivery. Or it could be both. It could be that you are creating fake beneficiaries so as to get more money. Part of it you pocket it, and part of it you use it to provide a better public services. Now, we ask 3 main questions. First, what is the role that political alignment plays in this? And we're going to find that aligned politicians produce more ghosts. Then, what do politicians coordinate for? Is it to provide a better public service or for capture? And we're going to provide evidence that it's mostly capture. And finally, if that is the case, why is it that people keep electing these people? How is it that they can hold on to power? And we're going to show some evidence that it's because these politicians are more willing to engage in electoral fraud, and so they can stay in power. There's a number of literature that we contribute to, of course, literature on corruption that looks at different causes and consequences of corruption. I think that what's important here and interesting is that we can talk a bit about the efficiency cost, in the sense that when you don't even know how many effective people you are serving, it's likely that you misallocate the money from the public sector. We're also looking at some implications of clientelism, but beyond sort of the emphasis on public versus privately provided goods, but also looking at how clientelism can be detrimental for corruption. We also look at, there's a long literature on the roles of political alignment, but there's not much that looks at the impacts on corruption. Also, you're going to see how this really relies on the idea that you have to provide some money as a function of the number of supposed beneficiaries, and these fixed rules can be manipulated, on which there has been a number of work. I actually have with Juan some work on that in Colombia, and there's many others who have looked at that. And finally, this could also speak to the idea that, many countries have spent a lot of money on education, but with limited effects, and part of the reason could be that part of the money is misspent. Okay, so this is just one very brief way to tell you what the theoretical framework we have in mind. And essentially, this is showing you a typical layer of clientelistic exchanges that happens in many developing countries, where a voter gives a vote to a local political leader. The leader gives some money or some other benefit to the voter, and then that leader takes up these votes to the local politician, who also gives some benefits to the leader. And what we are going to be exploiting here is that fact that that local politician that is engaging in this clientelistic exchange is probably doing so because he gets to power and then, interacts with contractors and things like that, and he gets some money out of it. But what is really important for us is that when this politician is connected to an upper level politician, there are more opportunities in terms of contracts, jobs, funds, future career prospects. There's probably less oversight from a more powerful politician. And so the connected politician is much more likely in this network of clientelistic exchange to produce more ghosts. And that's basically our hypothesis that we're going to look at. Now, the fact that clientelism is prevalent in Colombia is not disputed at all. And this is just some estimates from other work of ours in which we're looking at the prevalence of vote buying. And you can see that it is very prevalent, which is what I'm showing you for urban, rural, and all areas. And in the third estimate in each one of these graphs, what I'm showing you is whether people are ashamed or not to admit to clientelism, and they are not. So this is a prevalent and well socially accepted phenomenon in Colombia. Okay, so I want to tell you as much as I need to about the context, and I think the most important thing that I want you to take away from this slide is if you look at the table, which is establishing how is it that money for education is spent in Colombia. There are different accounts. There is account for payroll to pay for teachers. There is account for trying to improve quality. There is an account of trying to improve access. And it's transferred by the central government to the different entities in charge of schooling. But what I want you to look at is in the last column, when it talks about the distribution criteria, you can very easily find out that all of the money that gets in any of these accounts is at least partly a function of enrollment. So if you are a local politician and you can increase the enrollment in the books, in terms of how many students supposedly there are, you are going to get more money. So that's the basic idea that we're exploiting, that when you get more people enrolled in schooling, then you get more money, and therefore you have an incentive to create ghost students to get more money. Now, how do we measure corruption? That's not easy in general, and it's not easy in this case. But we're lucky enough that in 2012, following a media scandal with one of the cases in which the schools were really packed with ghost students, they're almost ghost schools, the government hired an independent audit study that tried to be as comprehensive as possible, nearly central, in which they did a detailed verification going school to school, verifying face-to-face whether the student existed in fact or not. And the school only had 24 hours to dispute a potential finding of a ghost student. So they really couldn't make up the evidence. And it was very easy to see either the student was there or he wasn't there because he called in sick, but there were clearly grades about the students. There were clearly some, paintings that he had done the day before or whatever. So with this audit, we have a good measure of the ghosts in the public system, what came out to be nearly 150,000 ghost students in Colombia. So in terms of the impacts, the main effect that we find, which is estimated from a regression discontinuity design, in which we look at cases in which a politician that is aligned with a governor, so a local politician here will be a mayor, and the national or the upper level politician will be a governor. The first one at the level of a municipality, and the second one at the level of a department, which is roughly equivalent to what would be a county or a state, respectively, in the US. And when these politicians are aligned, when the local level politician is aligned with the upper level politician, we find that we expected in this logic of the clientelistic network exchanges an effect that is positive and meaningful in terms of increased cost that you can see in these figures, in which I'm showing you the regression discontinuity estimates for linear local polynomials or quadratic local polynomials. So the important thing here is that we see a jump precisely in two very similar municipalities in terms of their political competition between aligned and non-aligned politicians. Only that one just barely elected a governor-aligned politician and one didn't, and the ones that are aligned produce more ghosts. Now, you of course want to look at robustness of these estimates, so we look at different things that I won't discuss in detail here, but actually adding in controls, changing the type of kernel that you use, changing the type of polynomial that you use. And in general, this is very, very robust. It's even robust to including party fixed effects, which is useful because it allows you to rule out the idea that it's simply that bigger parties are more likely to be aligned and therefore are more likely to end up winning these races, and for other reasons perhaps are more likely to have more ghosts. We also do the usual checks for RDD designs, making sure that this is not too sensitive to different bandwidths of how close elections we look at. We also look at whether this is balanced in meaningful ways, in the sense that municipalities in which the governor-aligned politician win are comparable to the ones in which he loses. And we indeed find that that is the case. These municipalities are not different in previous election outcomes. Actually, previous election outcomes do not predict the election outcome that we are looking at, which is the production outcome in the year 2011. So, overall, a very good balance. Also a very good balance in terms of how the schools from the control and the treatment municipalities look, and also how these municipalities themselves look. And we also have some exercises following some of recommendations of John Marshall in this context, in which you also have to look at how similar the candidates themselves are. So, and finally, one last check, we don't find any evidence of manipulation. Okay, so in general, we find a pretty consistent effect of being aligned. Now, we have complementary results that I'm going to summarize in a couple of slides. The first is what makes these effects worse. And one thing that makes them worse is the fact that some municipalities have more autonomy than others in how to use the resources. And we find that these municipalities have a much bigger effect on ghosts when they are aligned. And we talked to former education secretaries, and they basically told us, well, you can take advantage of being a certified and therefore autonomous municipality for good and bad things, but you certainly can take a lot of advantage. And they were meaning, you can really do bad things with this. In the sense that they can, use more contracts and take kickbacks from the contracts, and it becomes more valuable to presume to have more ghosts, because that becomes more resources, not only from the transfers, but from other things that come together with trying to serve those supposed students. And therefore, it's natural that in this network of voluntaristic exchanges, you can take more advantage when you're autonomous. And as you would, it is also worse when there is institutional weakness, when there are bad checks and balances, where the school quality is bad and maybe professors are not as well qualified or motivated, and parents cannot oversee the school as much. Now, all of what I told you up to now could be that aligned majors increase ghosts because they have connections to these higher echelons of power, which provide more opportunities for clientelism. Diversion is stronger with more autonomy because this facilitates maximizing private rents. And this is bigger where institutions are weak because this reduces chances of getting caught. But I must admit that it could also be that officials fabricate ghosts to obtain resources so that they can invest them, because the ones that they are entitled to are just too scarce. Aligned majors could have more interest to do this because they could have more coordination, or they could claim more credit than non-aligned ones. And the stronger effects in autonomous municipalities could only reflect that there are more incentives where you can use these resources as you believe is better. And the larger impact in weakly institutionalized places could reflect an omitted variable of more urgent needs for extra funds. So, how can we decide whether this is for public benefit or for capture? What we do is we look at a number of other outcomes that I don't have time to go through in detail, but essentially, we find that these places do not receive better or more education. They don't do better in test scores. They don't serve more students. When you adjust by the number of ghosts, enrollment rates are not better. Moreover, if this happens, then you would have to ask, well, why is it then that people select these politicians? And it turns out that what we find is that these types of politicians are engaged more in accusations of fraud, no? So it's consistent with these politicians being engaged in a number of, usage of contracts and diversion of resources that is consistent with what we think they're doing. And it turns out that after this, you could expect them to do worse because they are punished by voters, or precisely because they are in the network of clientelistic exchange, precisely because they can do things as corrupting the elections by buying votes, they could be able to persist in power. And actually what we find is that some evidence that they do electorally better, but definitely evidence that they are more likely to engage in electoral fraud. So the way in which they try to persist is through these mechanisms. So this is my last slide. To sum up, we find diversion of government funds that in general could be used for private benefit or to pass some of the benefits to citizens. Our findings are consistent with, instead, resource extraction, particularly valuable to politicians who are connected to the political network, particularly in areas with weaker accountability and where there's more discretion to use these resources. And at least a substantial part of the money is diverted for political and economic gain, rather to improve the quality of service of public services. Now, the first item in this list here is concerning, of course, because that type of politician who is very well engaged with the networks could persist in power. And the second two are concerning because this could exacerbate inequalities. Are places that are relatively worse off to begin with have more reasons to stay worse off. So that's the essence of our study. I thank you very much for your time, and I hope to having been able to stay on the time frame, Juan.
You did, yes. Perfect. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thank you for an excellent paper. And the second paper that we have in today's panel on state building, the political economy of state building in Latin America is by Micaela Sviatschi from Princeton University. Micaela, you're very welcome, and the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Juan, and thank you, Leopoldo, for your talk. I have some questions, but this was super interesting. So I'm very happy to present here. This is joint work with Juan as well and Wilber Baires. We are going to talk about the unintended effects of enfranchisement. There. So just to motivate, as many of us know, standard models of electoral competition in general, they suggest that enfranchisement may increase political participation and shift policies in favor of those that were previously excluded. And on this, there is abundant evidence on the positive effects of enfranchisement of women, also African American, We also have some evidence for Latin America in Brazil, how less educated citizens benefit. A more general idea here is that these extensions of franchise shift the median voter and increase redistribution to this new median voter. However, here, what we are going to see that this may not be always the case. For instance, in weakly institutionalized environment, this may not result in higher political participation or redistributions toward these communities that were intended to benefit from enfranchisement. And this can be the case if democracies are captured or constrained. For example, if non-state actors are able to control whether or how people vote, this democratization may not increase the welfare of the enfranchised communities and may even have unintended consequences. And this is actually the context that we are going to talk today, which is El Salvador. And we're going to study the effects of this residential voting reform, which main goal was to increase political participation by reducing the transaction cost associated to go to vote. And before this presidential voting program, rural and marginal urban areas had very low density of voting booths, and citizens had to travel long ways basically to vote in the main urban center. So with the reform, what happened was that the voting booths increased by a lot. There were like 360, and this increased to 1,500. And the idea was to bring the vote to the doorsteps of the household. And this was a massive expansion of these voting booths that this was distributed all across the entire country. And these actually include areas that were under the control of powerful organizations, which are criminal gangs, which are known in El Salvador to restrict mobility of individuals that live under their territory. And this is a huge concern. For instance, to enter into an area that is under gang control, you need permission, and if not, you can even be killed by entering these areas or moving around. So this is the context here. So the reform, what it did was basically automatically to each voter, it was assigned to the polling station closest to their residence. How they did it before the reform was that people had to go to the urban centers, and basically you were assigned to a voting booth based on the first letter of your last name. And this changed. Now you were assigned basically to the closest one. So this provides like this variation in people's real exposition to the new voting opportunities, with some basically decreasing the cost because now you can go to a near voting booth, but for some others this may increase this voting cost because now, think about it, you are in an area that now your voting booth is in an under control with gang presence area, and maybe you are not allowed to go. Or it could also be the case that you're assigned to go to, you are in a gang located area with gang presence, and now your voting booth is in the rival gangs. So this increases your cost of participating in any democratic election. So in the end of the day, the effects of this residential voting reform on political participation and also the redistribution can be ambiguous when you have these actors. So just to give you a bit more of context about how first this gang originated in El Salvador. So as you may all know, there was a big civil war that lasted until 1992. And during the civil war, many families with their young kids fled this violence and established actually in the US, in Los Angeles, in poor neighborhoods that were not the best location. There were already African-American gangs, Mexican gangs. And what the story said is that many of these Salvadorian kids that were young back then, they formed new gangs, which one was the MS-13, and some others joined the Mexican gang, which was Vargas 18. At the beginning, there were just small street gangs, but then they end up in prison. In prison, they accumulated criminal capital related to extortion and drug trafficking. And then, as a change in deportation policies in 1996, these gang leaders were sent back to El Salvador, where they exported this criminal capital. And there is a lot of evidence that they went to their hometown, which we're going to exploit for identification. But the most important is that they brought this criminal capital associated to extortion, drugs, and associated violence, so much that today El Salvador is one of the world's most murderous countries in the world. And this is mainly because of these two gangs fighting for territorial control to extort or sell drugs. So this is the context. So we will see like now in the map that you will have a lot of areas in El Salvador under gang control or gang presence. Another thing that we are going to exploit is a gang truce. But just to give you more context about what happened after the civil war ended, basically the main insurgent group, which was the left-wing FMLN, became the main opposition party. So there was always Arena, which was the incumbent conservative. And even though after the Civil War, this insurgent group became the main opposition, it was not until 2009 that actually the FMLN won a presidency. And this is important because basically it changed the enforcement approach that they were having before. In the whole 2000, what we had was like a very massive imprisonment of these criminal actors, very iron fist policies. But this changed in 2012 with the FMLN, which basically they sat down with the gang leaders that were actually imprisoned in El Salvador, and they negotiate a reduction in homicides with exchange of better prison conditions for these gang members. And this truce was incredible because in 24 hours, the homicide rates declined by 50%. So this was super big. But as you know, probably from this was not popular because this was done under secrecy between the government and the gangs. It didn't have that much popular support because even though homicide rates declined, extortion activities were still going. So the truce broke after a year and a half. However, a lot of people argue that the truce basically benefit the gangs because now they gain some political capital. They learned how to negotiate. They became political actors that they could like do things in favor of the group. And actually, there is a lot of this of qualitative evidence that politicians from the FMLN, which was the party that negotiated truce, reestablished contact with these gang leaders in order to obtain their support ahead of the 2014 presidential election. So this is important for our context because we will separate the results in kind of like before and after the truce. We have this kind of nice experiment which basically compared these gang members in kind of like political actors. So this is a map of El Salvador in 2003. In black, you have the voting post. So here, and in red, you have the gang control areas. And as you can see, in 2015, when all the expansion ended, how all the voting posts expanded across the whole country, and it also covered areas with gang control. Of course, here we are showing you the things at the municipality level, but there is variation within municipalities in the neighborhoods that gang control, and that's something that we're exploring. We cannot show that because of like confidentiality agreements, but this is something that we are going to exploit. So as you can see, so these generate a lot of heterogeneities on which would be the effects of the reform, which we are going to exploit. So how we are going to analyze the effect of this reform is we are going to do the standard difference in difference and an event study analysis, and we are going to explore this heterogeneity in gang presence in 2002, before the expansion of this residential reform. And we are also going to instrument the areas that we have gang presence with the place of birth, whether a gang leader was deported from the US, was born in that location. Another thing that we explore for heterogeneity that I'm not putting here is that we have this map that shows exact locations under gang control within a municipality, and we also use that map as well. And the further heterogeneity that we are going to use is we are going to use the time heterogeneity to try to see how the effects change before and after this gang truce, because the truce changed the violent behavior of these gangs, and also because the incumbent plausibly used this gang as political brokers to gain electoral support. So this is the specification that we are going to do the first, the difference in difference. The analysis will be at the municipality level, where we have all our outcomes that are going to be turnout and also economic activity that we proxy with light density. We put municipality fixed effects, time fixed effects, also time trends by municipality. The next thing that we do is to explore this heterogeneity, and we do the event analysis. What I'm going to show you today for a matter of time is just these specifications that we can see, and I'm going to separate in the period of the truce and the period after the truce. So let's start with turnout. So this is the whole period, which includes the period where these gangs were gaining this spot that had this after the truce. And what we see as the overall, even if we don't separate between gang and non-gang areas, we see a small increase in turnout, which has an important heterogeneity, because when we separate, we see that the small increase in turnout is only driven by these non-gang areas. And actually, in the gang areas, we see some evidence of a decline. if we focus in the period where the gangs were not having any negotiation with governments, we see that the effects are even larger. So turnout declined by 5 percentage points this is in gang areas. So the effects are even larger in this period where the gangs were not negotiating. Next, the other thing that we do is to try to exploit heterogeneity on whether the gangs were competing or not. Because one of our main stories is that in areas where you have two gangs, where it's not that you have one gang having a monopoly, these effects can be more prevalent because now the costs for you to go to vote are higher in places where both gangs are competing or where both gangs have territorial control. And we see that that's the case. Basically, we estimate the effects by different types of gang competition. This is, we do it by measuring the Herfindahl index of our measure of gangs. And we see that most of the effects are much larger, this decline in turnout, in areas where there is a lot of gang competition. And again, the effects are much larger in the period before the truce, before the gangs start negotiating. Next, we look to economic activity. This is something that we measure with light density because we don't have any outcome. We are trying now to get some outcome with administrative data about public investment, but this is what we have so far. And what we see again the same pattern, that in areas that do not have any gang presence or territorial control, we see an increase in economic activity, but the opposite, this reverse once you move into gang control areas. And again, the effects are very much concentrated in the places where there is much more gang competition, where basically you have the two gangs. And we do all these results using, as a measure of gang competition, these homicides committed by gangs, and also by using the map that shows the exact locations where there are different gangs within a municipality. And we see exactly the same results. Interestingly, the next thing that we wanted to know is, okay, how this changed the vote shares, no? Especially because we have this very interesting thing with the truce, where we know that FMLN kind of like negotiated with them. So let's focus on the period, in the whole period, which includes when gangs were actors. We don't see any kind of like interesting pattern here. If anything, there are no effects on the vote share of this left-wing party. However, if we focus in the period before the truce, when the FMLN was not negotiating, they were the ones that were actually losing most of the vote shares, basically due to the reform in these gang control areas. However, this starts mitigated once they start negotiating. And interestingly, and this is, I think, is the last result that I have, I know I'm showing a lot and there is a lot to digest, is that we see that once the FMLN start negotiating with its gangs, the vote share of Arena declines. So when before, they were not having any impact, if anything. Arena is the conservative party, which this shed lights on something of this negotiating that FMLN keep doing with the gangs after the gang truce. So what we learn from here? So with this preliminary result that I'll show you, what we learned is first is that this residential was sought to increase political participation by de facto enfranchising those with high cost to vote in El Salvador. However, in this context where, because of this gang territorial control that is so prevalent in El Salvador, it ended up de facto disenfranchising some citizens, which actually translated in lower economic activity. And in addition, the other piece of evidence that we show is that after the FLN gang truce, this vote share of this party that negotiated with did increase in gang control areas, consistent with this idea that gangs could be acting as political brokers. Something that I haven't shown that because this is work in progress that we are still doing, is that we also saw that there were better, actually we validated that truth, and we see that there were started having better conditions for the gangs in those locations with Princeton data. This is qualitative, but it's something that we also observe in the data. So what we learn from here, first we contribute to this literature on how violent actors affect electoral outcomes. Here we can show how having this non-state actor, which is something that happens a lot in developing countries, especially Latin America, can offset the potential benefits of an electoral reform, and also how incumbent parties can take advantage of this gang territorial control to kind of gain some electoral returns. We also contribute to edit on how the location of polling places affects the cost of voting and therefore political participation. Here we show that location matter also in terms of illegal territorial control. And lastly, we also contribute to this literature about how parties use political brokers to buy turnouts. Here, an important broker can be these non-state actors like gangs. And lastly, our paper is related to all this new literature that Juan has many papers about how well-intended policies can backfire in weakly institutionalized environments, which we have many examples. And that's all for today. Thank you so much. I think I did super fast, no?
Yeah, very well. Both of you have been excellent on time. Thank you so much for that. Thank you for presenting the paper, Mika. And finally, we have the paper by Luis Martinez from University of Chicago. Uh, Welcome to this session, Luis. Before that, let me remind the audience that after Luis's presentation, we're going to have some time, uh, a little bit over 5 minutes for Q&A. So please do type your questions in the box that is intended for that, and we're looking forward to the discussion. So without further ado, Luis, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Juan, and thank you everyone for joining. What I will be presenting today is a paper titled Dictatorship, Higher Education and Social Mobility. This is joint work with my colleague Maria Bautista at Harris and with Felipe Gonzalez at Católica in Santiago, Pablo Muñoz, who is at Getulio Vargas, and Munu Prem, who is a colleague of Juan's at El Rosario. And it's, wait, is this working? Yes, it is. And it's great to follow up on the paper that Mika just presented because there are some shared elements. In particular, our paper focuses on the relationship between political regimes and redistribution with a special focus on higher education. And so as you all heard from Mika a couple of minutes ago, there's this big theoretical claim about how there should be this strong link between democracy and redistribution. And some of the most prominent theories of democratization and regime change put a lot of emphasis on that. But in fact, when you look at the empirical evidence on democracy and redistributive policies, on democracy and reductions in inequality, the evidence is highly inconclusive. Now, the focus of our paper is universities. And we focus on universities because we think that these institutions are arguably important contributors to social mobility. People often talk of education as the great equalizer, but universities are very interesting also because they're an important, a major source of political activism and political mobilization. And so kind of the intuition that guides our research here is this idea that perhaps under an authoritarian regime, there should be a weaker incentive to foster and expand higher education, and this could have negative downstream effects on social mobility and other outcomes. So we hypothesize some type of negative link, some type of negative effect of dictatorship on the functioning and the size of higher education. But bear in mind that this hypothesis is far from trivial because on the one hand, authoritarian regimes may fear a potential trade-off between, it's true, there's a political threat from universities, and so they don't want them to get out of control. But at the same time, if you crack down on higher education, if you have a smaller number of professionals, this potentially leads to a less educated workforce and a lower rate of economic growth and so on. So there's a trade-off between the economic cost of a reduction in higher education and the political threat of a larger higher education sector. At the same time, you could also imagine that people might get upset if they face reduced educational opportunities, and that there could be some type of political backlash that could in fact potentially compromise the stability of an authoritarian regime. So even though intuitively it seems as if these type of regimes have good reasons not to be too friendly to higher education, it is not obvious that that is the case. Now, the specific focus of our paper is higher education during the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile. And we try to answer three interrelated questions. The first one is we try to understand the changes that Chilean universities experienced after the 1973 coup that overthrew Salvador Allende and brought Pinochet to power. And then we examine what were the socioeconomic consequences of these changes to higher education, with keeping an eye on the potential for persistence. Does this, if we see some negative effects, are these transmitted across generations, that type of thing. And finally, we try to connect our results on education to this pivotal political moment in Chilean history, which is the 1988 plebiscite, where basically Pinochet lost, and this really catalyzed or boosted the democratic transition. And so we want to know, did the changes to education implemented by the military regime in the early 1970s, are they connected somehow to the behavior of Chileans at the polls in 1988? So just to give you some quick background, in the years before the military coup, higher education was rapidly expanding in Chile. There were 8 universities in the country. Only 2 of them were public, as in run by the government. But in fact, the whole entire system was largely reliant on public funding. And there's a number for you. In 1972, the year before the military coup, almost 80% of the total revenue in higher education came from government subsidies and transfers. And in the decade before the coup, we observed this dramatic expansion in enrollment, both under the Christian Democrat government of Frei, but also under the socialist government of Salvador Allende. And so just to give you some perspective, while in 1960, there were approximately 25,000 university students in Chile, in 1973, the year of the coup, this had risen to almost 150,000. Now, September 11, 1973, the military coup overthrows Allende, and a military junta led by Augusto Pinochet takes over, and the junta will rule the country until 1990. What happens? How do they approach higher education? Well, this slide tries to really boil it down, to really summarize it. So, as you can expect, universities were quickly targeted as part of the regime's attempt to eliminate any type of political opposition. So more specifically, just 2 weeks after the military coup, the junta appointed members of the armed forces as rectors of all universities, claiming that they had become centers for Marxist indoctrination. And what followed is precisely what you would expect: a wave of repression, which involved dismissals, which involved people being fired, some people being arrested, and as many of you are aware, some of that led to torture, forced disappearances, illegal executions, and so on. However, something that is interesting about this context is that not long after the coup, there starts to be the second policy objective, and it has a lot to do with the growing influence over policy of a set of economists known as the Chicago Boys. And this is a set of market-friendly economists that get their nickname from the fact that they were trained at the University of Chicago. And basically, the Chicago Boys are very critical of the status quo concerning higher education. They argue that these universities are bloated and inefficient, that these subsidies distort the educational decisions of individuals. They argue that the money that the government is spending on universities, it would be better spent at lower levels. So they're very critical of these university system that has expanded so dramatically over the previous years. And of course, what ends up happening is a combination of these two forces. So there's this very nice quote from a paper by Levy in 1986 that says, look, the regime's penchant for political control meshed very conveniently with its penchant for economic conservatism. Like the Chicago Boys were saying, the right economic policy is to make the university smaller, to not give them so much money, and the military advisors that cared about political stability and repression and so on said, that's a terrific idea. And so what ends up happening is that universities are forced to downscale in a dramatic way. So this graph is showing you in the x-axis, you have years. This is all just descriptive data. And this figure in the one that has the little red triangles is the share of the government's education budget that is going to higher education. And so as you can see, in the late 60s, early 70s, under Allende, this shoots up dramatically. Universities are growing rapidly. The government sees universities as a means for social mobility. You know, there's a growing urban middle class that demands expanded educational opportunities. So lots of money is being poured into universities. But you can see that shortly after the coup, 1974 afterwards, this completely bends and goes right back down to a level similar to where it was a decade before. The consequence of this is universities struggle to raise revenue from other sources, so they just have to downscale their operation. And perhaps the best evidence of this is if I just show you these little circles are the gross enrollment rate, which you can see is steadily growing under Frey, shoots up dramatically under Allende, and after the coup just crashes and comes back down. Importantly, we have been able to gather some additional evidence that suggests that this was largely driven not by the students that were already enrolled and decided to quit, but by a lower number of incoming students entering university every year. So in this plot, again, the x-axis are years, and the y-axis is showing you the little squares are the total number of openings made available by universities every year. The circles are the number of applicants. So this gives you a sense of the demand and supply of university spots every year. And what you can see, there's two big things that I want you to notice. The first one is that you can see that at any point in time, the number of people applying to university exceeds the number of spots. So this reduction in enrollment that I showed you here, it's not because seats are being left unfilled, it's because of supply. You know, this is telling us, look, supply is the binding constraint on enrollment. If enrollment is going down, it has to be because supply is going down. And in fact, that is what the figure shows. That's the second thing I wanted to point out. So you can see how the number of vacancies, the number of openings is increasing. After the coup, it kind of stagnates and falls. So what we are documenting here is this sharp constraint of the supply of higher education. What we then do in the paper is to try to understand what were the socioeconomic effects of this. And for this, we do a cohort level analysis where kind of the I don't know whether to call it the identifying assumption is that the age of college enrollment cannot be easily manipulated. You know, if you are 18, 19, and you see that things are not looking good, you can postpone college for a year, maybe two, but it's hard to say, I'll go to college in 10 years. Similarly, if you're 14, 15, and things are not going well, it's not like you can say, oh, I'm going to quit high school and go to college now. And so what we argue is that this reduction in the educational opportunities, in the access to higher education, disproportionately affected people that reached college age around this time. And to analyze this, we use data from the census and from a large household survey called HACEN. And what I'm going to show you over the next couple of minutes are several plots like this. Give me a second, Mike. I just realized that my computer might run out of power, which would be terrible for the prospect of this presentation. But there we are. So I'm going to show you several plots like this. In these plots, the x-axis corresponds to cohorts, which we're classifying in terms of the age in which they reached, in the year in which they reached age 21, because that was the average age of first-year college students around this time. And this is very simple. This is pretty much just plotting the raw data. These little markers are just averages, cohort level averages. So as you can see in this figure here, the outcome is the share of people with any college education. And you can see how it is sloping upwards before the coup. And after the coup, there's this sharp kink and it bends down. And all we wanted to do was we wanted to look at socioeconomic outcomes downstream and to see whether we observe a similar pattern, similar types of kinks. And the answer to that is yes. I will go briefly over these plots, but the message that they convey is that the reduced access to education brought about by the policies of the military regime dramatically affected the life circumstances of these people. If you look at occupations, you know, this is professionals. doctors, engineers, lawyers, and so on, you see this dramatic reversal in the share of people with an occupation like this. Some of these people get clerical jobs in offices. Some of these people go to services and sales, waiters, waitresses, bartenders, stuff like that. Some of these people go all the way down the occupational pyramid to elementary occupations, selling food on the street, doormen, stuff like that. So, dramatic effects. If we look at labor force participation, we also see clear evidence that it bends down for these affected cohorts, whether we do this in the census or in the survey. If we look at unemployment rate, we see clear evidence that it bends upwards for these cohorts. If we look at income, of course, this is a bit noisier because this comes just from the survey and it's self-reported, but still the pattern in the data kind of visually suggests the presence of a downward kink. If we look at measures of wealth, this is the probability of being in the richest 20%. You can see how it bends down. If we look at the bottom quintile, the probability of being in the bottom 20%, you can see how it bends up. So what we see is that these unlucky cohorts that reached college age after the coup were dramatically affected, and their life circumstances forever changed by these policies. Now, in my last couple of minutes, I want to talk to you about a couple of extra results. So like I said, one object of interest for us is a potential relationship between the educational policy and the political outcomes. As I already hinted at, in 1988, there's this key plebiscite. Voters decide whether they want to keep Pinochet in power or whether they want to have open presidential elections. It would seem like a no-brainer, but still. What ends up happening is that the no to Pinochet and having elections wins with 55% of the votes. What we do is something, it's just suggestive evidence, but still I find it quite interesting. We use the fact that in the census, we can calculate for each county, for each municipality, a measure of this kink in college attainment, a measure of this kink in college enrollment. And so all we want to do is we want to know whether counties that were more strongly affected by the educational policy, counties that have sharper downward kinks, do they vote differently from those that were not so much affected? And when we do that, we get something like this. So in the x-axis, this is just a bin scatter plot. In the x-axis, you can see a standardized measure of this kink in college enrollment. In the y-axis, you can see the county level vote share against Pinochet. And the big takeaway is that you can see that these counties over here that experience the most negative downward kinks, the most negative kinks in college enrollment, are the ones that vote against Pinochet at the largest rates. So at least in terms of the correlation, there is this strong pattern where counties that were more hardly affected and experienced a sharper reduction in college enrollment increasingly voted against Pinochet. And that is interesting in terms of the literature because the literature has thought of the demand for democracy as a normal good along the lines of modernization theory. More educated, richer people are the ones that demand democracy. Here we're documenting the opposite. Those people that were denied access to education are in fact the ones that vote against the dictator and demand democracy. In my last result, abusing the fact that Mika and Leopoldo did so well on time, and so I get
just a
one extra minute.
clarification, Luis, a clarification about this one. So the no vote share is for the affected cohorts in those counties, or is for everyone?
It's for everyone. It's for everyone. So counties where more people didn't get to go to college are counties where the vote share no is higher. But yeah, we have no way the data is aggregated at that level. That's great, Mika.
Thank you.
So finally, we say, okay, Chile returned to democracy in 1990. Are there some long-lasting, persistent effects of this? And for this, we try to connect parents and kids. And we do this in a somewhat brutish way, given informational constraints, which is we rely on the 2017 census. The census contains information on household composition, and so we're able to identify kids that live with their parents or parents that live with their kids and stuff like that. Most of the combinations are household heads and their children that live under the same roof. Bear in mind that the children that we're looking at, on average, are in their late 20s. And as Mika, Juan, Leopoldo can probably confirm, in Latin America, it's not that uncommon for people in their late 20s to still live with their parents. So even though the sample, of course, has some selection into it, it's not like we're looking at a very unusual sample. What do we find? Well, the figure here on the left is showing you the college attainment of these parents that were able to connect. And so you see a pattern similar to the overall sample where college enrollment is increasing before the coup and then it crashes down. But where I want you to focus your attention, and this is my last result, is the sample of children with parents in these cohorts here in panel B. And so these are people that reached college age in the late 90s, early 2000s after democratization. But what you can see is a pattern very similar. People with a parent in these affected cohorts also experience this sharp downward kink in college enrollment. And we think this is interesting when you think of the previous years, the levels of social discontent in Chile and so on. Maybe part of the explanation resides in this, that even though Chile has done very well as a whole, there's high levels of inequality. There's a big segment of the population that seems to have been left behind. So to wrap up, what we learned from this paper is that the military regime had a large impact on the functioning and the size of higher education in Chile, and that these changes had sizable and long-lasting socioeconomic effects, and that they hindered social mobility for an entire generation. Importantly, these diminished educational opportunities negatively affected support for the regime when a democratic window of opportunity arose. Thank you so much for your attention, and sorry that I went a bit over.
Thank you so much, Luis. Very, very interesting presentation, and a lot of progress since I last saw the paper, by the way. So we do have some time for questions and comments, but I don't know if it's the fact that I'm using my cell phone. This is because I'm in a part of Colombia with very little internet connection, so I have to rely on my data. But I don't see any question. I don't know if it's a problem of myself. Do you guys see questions? I just see
No.
just appraising for Mika's presentation, but nothing else. So if we don't have questions from the audience, what about questions from one another? So do you have questions or comments to someone else's papers? I can kick off very briefly, and let's maximize comments rather than engaging in Q&A because we have very little time. Just I was curious about the results, Luis, on the plebiscite and the negative relationship between how much you got affected by the educational policy and the probability of the no plebiscite in that municipality. So what is the underlying model that you have in mind for that? Because in some model, so most of voting models are forward-looking models. So given that you were screwed up in terms of education, I mean, that's it. Is that you don't take that into account anymore when you decide whether to vote for the yes or the no? So is this some sort of altruistic model that you have in mind, in which I got screwed up, but my kids should not get screwed up, so I vote for democracy rather than seeking to Pinochet? That would be my my comment. But as I said, I don't expect you to answer because it's better to maximize sort of feedback at this stage. So Mika, you wanted to say something. I interrupted you, I think. Go ahead.
No. I was just writing just in case we ran out of, because it was not, there is nothing that, it mainly is like follow-ups and clarification questions. I love the two papers. I was thinking about, wanted to ask Leopoldo if he had like power to see if these effects of alignment, that when they are aligned, you see more ghosts, is the first time that you are, on power, or is it like persistent for people that are all the time, in power and aligned with the politician? Just to see, because it will be interesting to see if it is, you have the same politician like several times there, like, and maybe they are not doing it, or like if it is continuous, is a behavior of the ghost, or it's just, I think there are,
Yeah, good point. I can respond to Mika and then add my 2 cents for Mika and Luis. So we don't have too much power, and there's no. I'm not sure we can know whether the same people are in power, because many of these guys do not get elected more than once as mayors, but actually their friends do. So we can try to code it. It's interesting, but we have the power issue, and then the kind of typically majors just runs once, and sometimes they come
But
back
that's
after a
interesting
couple of
what you
periods and become majors again.
that's
Yeah,
interesting what you're
which
saying, because I
exacerbates the incentives to do this kind of thing.
yes, exactly, because if they are like only once, it's much more.
Mhm.
Okay, that's super cool. Thank you.
But you could also
Yeah, good
track
point.
their careers over time, right? Because maybe they don't return as mayors, but some of them run for the departmental assembly or for Congress or governor.
That we did, and we do find that the ones who barely win and are aligned are more likely to then appear as departmental assembly, congressmen, and so on, which could be because they use these resources, but of course could be other things that come with alignment, not just the one that we are studying, right? But we do find that they do better in their electoral careers, apparently. So yeah, so that's cool. Thank you both, Mika and Luis, for those remarks. The one thing that I wanted to suggest for Mika's and Juan's paper is,
Yes.
and I'm sorry that when you were presenting, Mika, my connection broke for a sec. So if you had results on these, I missed them. But since you've looked at these crime organizations so much, one question is, how do they capitalize these electoral benefits in their criminal business? And can you get at that anyway? Maybe it's a spin-off paper, and it would be a super interesting spin-off, or maybe it's part of this one. But okay, so here comes this opportunity to to be able to control politically a number of people. How do they take advantage of that for their criminal business? And if you have any proxy for that, that would be super, super interesting, I think. Which is, you mentioned how much of the literature that you noted is related to yours shows, how reforms backfire and so on, but you have this extra step on how you're actually aiding this criminal organization in doing what they want to do. And on Luis, I think I mentioned this last time that I saw this paper, and probably it's in the more detailed presentation or something. But one story that it's not that I believe it entirely, but I do think you have to address it, is that in a very unequal country with backward levels of educational attainment, that's probably Chile was in the 70s, it is not clear that the university is the great equalizer. Maybe if you want to do really progressive education spending, you should focus on basic education or early education. So this is partly for the framing and partly just to rule out, do you have any way to look at, is it that this alternative story, again, I don't believe it given Pinochet's ideology, given your results on voting and a bunch of other things, but it will be interesting to see if it's not that they are compensating this decreased support to university by increased support to basic education and early education.
That's a great comment, Leopoldo. That's what the Chicago boy said. I didn't know you were a Chicago boy, but
I also warn you that I don't believe in this,
but more seriously, that is a great point. And in the paper, we try to be a bit more careful about not getting into muddy waters regarding the efficiency effects of this thing, focusing more on the distributional effects. Just saying, we do have some evidence suggesting that there are no major gains in primary and lower levels and so on, but you're absolutely right. That's like the $1 million question, and that's a question that is very hard to answer. So here we're a bit agnostic, and we say, even if overall this was good, notice that there was a big distributional effect. But yes, that's a terrific point.
Thank you so much, guys. So I do want to ask the organizers who are listening to this, because we're well past the hour now, but I don't know if we are by keeping the conversation, we are using some others Zoom time at this stage, and we should actually close the conversation now. Can an organizer respond to that? Because otherwise we can keep.
You can continue.
Thank you so much. Mika, there is a question from you in the chat, methodological question.
Yes, about the synthetic control method. Yes, we could use it like basically to try to, and that's our next step, to try to do like some synthetic control on matching different so that we could have similar municipalities that got the RB. That's something that is in our to-do list. Hamid, thank you.
All right. So this has been great. thank you, everyone, and thank you for the audience that we had during this session, and for your interest and the questions. Also, thank you guys for accepting to participate in this and presenting your amazing papers. Uh, Given that we were given green light to keep using the link, I don't know if there are further comments on everyone else's papers, or we should uh, sort of close it here. Okay.
I'm good. I think these papers were great. Congratulations, Nika and Leopoldo.
Thank
It's
you,
the same as
everyone.
what Juan said. Based
Yeah.
relative to the previous iterations, they're so much better.
Thank you.
Yeah. So
And thank you, Juan,
Oh, we
for
got
coordinating.
amazing.
we got sound effects. Wow.
Well,
Never had such a majestic exit from a conference talk.